Hello everyone. Thanks so much everyone for coming. But how could you not come after Anusha's brilliant introduction of this session? I'm very happy to moderate and introduce the session on poverty, cognitive function, and decision making. Let me first sort of thank the organizers and everybody who's been helping to put together this fantastic conference. It's great to be here. This session will include three experts in poverty research. We'll start off with Ananda from University of Warwick, then Heather Schofield from UPenn will talk, and afterward Anusha from University of Chicago. I'll tell you a little bit about their work overall, what they're going to be talking about. Let me give you first some overview of what the session will be like. I'll tell you 15 minutes of like a brief introduction of the session. Then each of the speakers will talk for about 20 minutes, uninterrupted, unless there's sort of really burning questions that you might have. And then there will be 15 minutes of questions from the audience. So if you can, please hold your questions until then. Okay. So what I would like to start with is sort of the observations that over the past 2 decades, we have made a lot of progress in understanding the economic lives of the poor. And this was sort of pioneered by people like Ann Case and Angus Deaton. We've learned a lot about sort of careful surveying techniques, about sort of just understanding basic aspects of the lives of the poor. And then with the foundation of JPAL and IPA and other similar-minded organizations, there have been a large number of carefully conducted RCTs that taught us a lot about the economic lives of the poor, what it means to be poor in financial terms, what kind of decisions people make, economic decisions people make, and how we may be able to improve them through carefully designed policies. Such knowledge doesn't just come from RCTs, but also from careful surveys, such as the one you can see here, the Portfolios of the Poor by Karlan et al., which essentially just follow people, poor individuals' financial lives by tracking them every week. So every week they would sort of check in on people's finances, on their debt, on their expenses, on their savings and the like, which gives us a very good picture of the economic lives of the poor. And broadly speaking, we're taking together, we have a pretty good understanding, or a much better understanding than we used to, about the economic, or what it means to be poor in economic terms. And this is sort of a very broad set of knowledge that we have acquired through that. This range from like health, as you can see here, for example, we learned a lot about individuals' health status, what it means to be poor in terms of just survival probabilities. We learned a lot about the demand and supply for health and health behaviors and sort of its consequences. We also learned some somewhat surprising facts. For example, here's the fraction of individuals living in a household with a TV. And you might sort of think, well, that's actually much higher than we expected. Why do these individuals have a TV when they don't spend enough money on eating sufficiently or having enough to pay the doctor? We also learned quite a bit of not just, so when you think about sort of what poverty means for people, it's not just having low income levels, but also a huge amount of volatility in people's lives. And here for the Portfolios of the Poor, give some sort of striking examples of, you can see the revenues and inventory purchase and expenses for one particular person, of like how volatile some of the incomes and consumption patterns are for the poor. So it's not just people have like low income levels, so like $1 or $2 per day, but there's also a lot of variation. So sometimes they have like $20 on any given day, but then there's like a drought or like of revenues where they have like nothing for quite a while, and sort of there's huge struggles of people to sort of smooth these the variation over time. Now, we also learn a lot about sort of individuals that are involved in these studies. And the Portfolios of the Poor, but if you read like Poor Economics by Abhijit Banerjee and Esther Duflo, you read a lot of individuals who are sort of exposed to poverty and what kind of decisions they make, and then sort of give good examples and insights into the lives of the poor. So here, for example, you see Faisal. He's an example from the Portfolios of the Poor. And Faisal is from Uttar Pradesh in India, a physical laborer who has a household income from about like $30 to $40 per month. And in the story that's told, this individual breaks his legs, which is terrible for a physical laborer because you can't do work. In particular, Faisal did not have health insurance. So that's sort of the worst thing that can happen. He can't do any work, but he's also not compensated for that. So now in the story, Faisal then, instead of seeing a doctor, because he doesn't have a lot of money and savings and no insurance, he doesn't see a doctor immediately, but instead he sort of tries to go to some healer, try to sort of think, wait it out and to see whether things get better on its own. But as it turns out, that was like a pretty bad idea, or that turned out not well for him. Instead, it took about 6 months until he finally sort of like essentially sought treatment and got better. But sort of like he has now 6 months of lost wages and had to pay eventually health expenses from about $250, which is 8 months of his earnings as well. And one interesting part in the story is that Faisal, instead of like getting high interest rate loans, he was just, his family was getting a lot of interest-free loans from friends and neighbors. They're drawing down savings, they're consuming less and like, so there are many sort of ways in which that Faisal and his family managed to overcome this hardship. So it's sort of fair to say that overall we learned quite a bit of like what it means for Faisal and people like him to deal with health shocks and other sort of economic hardship. And we sort of understand a lot of the material consequences of such shocks. But what we don't understand that well is what is going on in Faisal's head. So what you understand is what the decision that he makes. We understand how much he earns, how much he saves, how much he borrows, and like we know about that. What we don't know much about is what kind of decisions, why does he make the decisions that he makes, what constrains his decision-making capacity, and how we could potentially help Faisal and others to make better decisions. We also don't know very well about how does he feel in such a situation. What makes him happy? Because after all, in any policies that we might want to make, we want to make people happier. But in some sense, we don't have a very good understanding what determines his or Faisal's and other people's happiness. And only recently, very recently, we have started to explore such questions. And you can think of this panel as like sort of a preliminary progress report of recent research that has sort of thought to tackle such question and try to get into the heads or in the minds of the lives of the poor and try to understand better what decisions they make and how we might be able to improve their decision-making processes. And you might sort of wonder, well, why should we do that? Why is it sort of important to understand individuals' cognitive function? Well, one answer is there are many, and this is based on many RCTs and careful studies, there are many seemingly suboptimal behaviors among the poor, and Anuj has already alluded to some of those earlier. There's underinvestment, undersavings, bad parenting, low productivity, lack of punctuality, low drug adherence, and the like. So many sort of like behaviors where you think, well, people could do better, but we don't really understand why they don't do better. And until recently, people have sort of come up with like perhaps sometimes compelling, but sort of maybe not the right explanation, which is sort of they're pretty bad environmental conditions. For example, lack of transportation might sort of like, or reliable transportation might explain lack of punctuality. Predatory lending might explain why people underinvest or like take too high loans. There might also be selection or omitted variables. For example, people just have low education. Well, if you have low education, then you're not productive, and you might also be a bad parent because you just don't understand some of the advice that you might be given. But what we're trying to focus on here is the treatment effect of poverty. That is, does being poor itself affect people's decisions and behaviors in ways that might be reinforcing poverty? And at the bottom line and in the back of our heads, minds, there should be sort of a question, or there is a question, is there perhaps what I want to call a behavioral poverty trap, in which the broad line of argument is, well, poverty impedes cognitive function, decision-making, and productivity through various ways, and this in turn may feed back to future poverty. And then, even if there's not a poverty trap itself, at the very least, this may lead to reduced mobility. So if you're poor and try to become richer, and Raj Chetty has quite a bit of work on that and co-authors recently in the US, how is it possible, or is it possible to become rich? And these factors that we're looking at here might sort of impede mobility. Now, let me sort of give you an overview of this session, and then let you enjoy the speakers' presentations. So first, we start off with Ananda, who you might know from, as Anuj also mentioned earlier, from the original scarcity work. So poverty, the idea here is that poverty captures people's minds and cognitive function, but cognitive function is limited, such that then, when poverty takes away a lot of people's cognitive function, well, then they might not be able to make as good of decisions that people might want to do. And Ananda will in particular talk about whether cash transfers and insurance mitigate such effects. And this sort of like, you can think of this as a progress report on the scarcity work that Ananda has done earlier. Then Heather will talk about other correlates of poverty. So it's not just the poor are poor, they don't have money, and they think about not having money a lot. Well, being poor also means that people are more likely to be in pain, they're more likely to be tired, they're more likely to be hungry, they're more likely to drink excessively, there are many other such factors. And you might sort of think, well, you're looking at research in psychology, you might think, well, these factors may affect cognition, decision-making, and productivity as well. And then Anuj finally will talk about the expertise of the poor. You can think of this as like sort of the upside or positive effects that we may also want to focus on, which is, well, poverty captures cognitive function. You might think, well, if poverty actually captures cognitive function, as in people focus a lot on poverty, well, that should entail some benefits as well. And Anuj will show some compelling evidence that, in fact, the poor actually do better, at least in some decisions or domains. That's all I have to say. So thanks so much for coming again. And we'll start off with Ananda with her work on scarcity. Thank you.
This is just set it up. Oh, I see. So I wouldn't be able to hear it. Okay. All right. Very good. Yeah, I think you said that. Okay. Just making sure I understand how this clicker works. Yep. Thank you all for coming. It's a pleasure to be here. I guess Frank has already mentioned very eloquently, a bunch of ways in which we are puzzled by the way poor people behave. And as he mentioned, some of this is about health, some of this is about parenting, some of this is also about, taking investment opportunities, which they've been shown to be very high return. The poor know that, and it's cheap to implement, and yet they don't do it. There's, work on fertilizer use is the thing I'm thinking about here. But the point here, as he alluded to, is that not all of this can be explained by lack of money. It doesn't take money to pay attention to how much TV your kids are watching, for instance. And so not all of this is about lack of information either. And so the kind of explanation we get left with is somehow the poor are quote unquote different, right? And people have very clear ideas about what they mean by different. So here's something from the World Values Survey. This is for the US, and people think that people who are poor are lazy and they lack willpower, right? More than half of Americans think that. And so the implicit idea here is that people make these bad choices, and that's what keeps them poor, right? And why do they make these bad choices? Either they're dumb, or somehow they lack the willpower. And that's what keeps them where they are, right? And in fact, that slide which I showed you on willpower is from this paper, which shows that when there's less sympathy, then the amount of support for redistributive taxation or welfare spending is much lower as well, right? But what we've been pursuing in this research agenda, which Frank gave you an overview of, is that maybe the causality goes somehow in the opposite direction. That instead of bad decisions being what leads to poverty, there's something potentially about poverty which ends up that people make these bad choices. In particular, is there something about being poor that actually makes you dumber, right? The state of being poor. And is it, does it somehow have an effect on your willpower potentially? And that's what then leads to these bad outcomes. So some of the work that I've already done with a bunch of co-authors, Sendil Mulainathan, Eldar Shafir, and Jiaying Zhao, is one of the things that we looked at was the first piece of what I had on that earlier slide. What is the impact of poverty on people's IQ? Does it somehow impair their cognitive function? And we found evidence for that doing this study with sugarcane farmers in South India, where we compare the same person with himself or herself, mostly himself because farmers are all male, but before and after a sugarcane harvest, where it's a very long crop cycle, and so just a month before the harvest, or even right after the harvest, they're down to the wire. They have very little money. And a few weeks after the harvest, they get their entire year's income. So we're sort of able to establish that. And I'd like to spend most of the rest of the time here talking what we're currently doing. And so today I'm going to say a little bit, one piece is about how does poverty have an effect on willpower? This is what we've been looking at. And this is, again, joint work with Anuj, who's here, and Senthil Mulainathan, and Paul Niehaus. And what's the context in which we've been looking at this question? We've been looking at this in the context of what's called an unconditional cash transfer, which means there are no strings attached. You just get a bunch of money, give that to a poor person. And this is in collaboration with an NGO called Give Directly, which operates in Kenya. And they make one-time unconditional, very large transfers to the tune of $1,000, no questions asked, to people whom they identify using various satellite technology measures of who is poor, right? And the measure of willpower that we are going to use is about, we ask transfer recipients when they want the money, and what we're going to use as our measure is how long they're willing to defer or delay their actual receipt of the grant. That's going to be our willpower measure. So let me tell you a little bit about the design. So a typical GD here is just Give Directly, the NGO. And typically, all these transfers are done through what's called M-Pesa or mobile money. So it's through your phone. You get the money. There's no intermediary involved. And every transfer has two stages. One, first, to just set it up, they have a token transfer. They want to make sure everybody's, their mobile account is working smoothly, et cetera, et cetera. So that's the first stage. They give a token transfer. And then in the second stage is the rest of the money. That's what I'm calling the main transfer. And so what we did as part of our intervention is, at that first stage, that's really where all our action is at the moment, is that we gave some people that token transfer in December of 2014. I'm calling them the early group. And then the other group that I'm calling the late group got it a month later. So that was in January of 2015. And then, before we made these token transfers, we had done an initial survey of all our recipients. And we did what I'm calling a follow-up survey, therefore, after we had given everybody that token transfer. And so because and in this follow-up survey, we asked them a bunch of questions about the main transfer itself, their preferences over that. In particular, we asked them, would you like this entire $965 in one shot, in a single tranche, or would you like it as two evenly spaced ones, or monthly ones? Right? And this was over the next 12-month period between Feb 2015 and Jan 2016. And then we also asked them, for each of these cases, so if I were to give you in one lump sum, what's the best, what's your first preference of the month in which you would want that transfer? And we asked them the second choice as well. So we did this for each of those cases. And the thing to note here is that for the people who had got the money in December, when we did this follow-up survey, it had been 30 days since they got the money. And for the people who were in what I'm calling the late group, it had been just 5 days, right? So one group potentially would have a little more cash left on hand when we did the survey than the other group, right? And that's really going to be, quote unquote, our measure of what I'm calling poverty, in the sense, or at least the perception of poverty, because they have a little more cash left because we gave them $35 just very recently, right? So that's our design. And what do we find? So first, just in terms of financial pressures. So the purple lines are the baseline, and I think the laser pointer probably does it. There is a laser pointer. So the purple lines are the baseline, and this is their response at follow-up. And so the early group, the people who got the money in December, if we look at their difficulty in coping with bills, we don't see a big difference between when we surveyed them before we made any token transfer and 30 days after we had made the token transfer. Whereas if you look at the people who got the money just 5 days ago, you see a big difference between how much difficulty they reported in baseline and what they talk about in endline. There wasn't actually a significant difference, even though it appears so here in terms of the worries about money, but in this we found a big difference. Now, the interesting thing here is that they had only $4 to $6 more left on hand, the people who we gave the money 5 days ago. They had spent a bunch of it anyway. But so it was more about how they felt in terms of their difficulty in coping with bills that was different. And so then, when we look at the data on when they would like the transfer over the next 12 months, what do we find? So the first thing, again, here, the orange is the early group, and the green is the late group. And what we find is that the late group is willing to delay the transfer systematically by about, on average, 2 weeks more, right? And we find this for the entire 12-month period. So some people want the money in February. A bulk of them really want it in the first 3 months, right? But for each of those months over the next 12, we always find that the people who are in the group who got the money 5 days ago, the late group, they're willing to wait longer. There are more people willing to wait longer in every case for every month. And then we also find that if I go to your second best month, we still find that effect. And if we look at it in the case of not just everything in one installment, 965 one shot, but even if I split it by 2 installments, we still find that they're willing to wait a week longer in terms on average to get the money. So we sort of take this as evidence that people are in fact, have stronger willpower just when they have a little more cash left on hand, not even that much, just $4 to $6, but they're feeling less worried. There was no effect in terms of the number of installments in which people wanted the money, whether they got the money early or late. And we did find some effects. We did this more as a robustness check because we're interested in the mechanism. We do find that people who got the money just 5 days ago, relative to their own initial performance in the baseline survey, do better on the IQ tests as well. And so what I take away from this then is that we think that this is showing, at least this is a really big decision how to spend when to get $965. You'd think that everybody would say, give it to me now. This is a whole year's income for these people. But in fact, we're finding that that's not the case. And what's very interesting here is that for people who are the poorer people, we see that it makes a bigger difference. Those same having $4 to $6 extra in their pocket makes a bigger difference in terms of their willingness to wait longer, and also people who have a bigger improvement in their IQ test performance relative to how they did in the baseline. They also are willing to wait longer. So this sort of really sort of connecting that mental bandwidth mechanism to willpower. So I'm going to move now to a study in a different setting. So this is sort of telling us, I think I'll reiterate this once again at the end, but I think the interesting takeaway I have here in terms of the design of cash transfer programs is that maybe it's actually better to give money to poor people who are poor when they have a little money left in their pocket, rather than when they're really down to the wire, because they actually have the space to think better about how they will use what they get. So that's the takeaway I would offer from this one. A very different study I'm doing in another part of the world. This is in Brazil. And I have to confess, I forgot to put my co-author's name on this slide. Guilherme Lechand is his name. He is just graduating from Harvard, from the Kennedy School, and moving to Zurich as an assistant professor. And so, conventionally, we've been, so far, when we talk about poverty, we've been thinking in terms of a low income level and how that affects what goes on in people's heads. But like with that slide, which Frank showed you, I know I must be Italian. I'm very used to using my hands. No, I'm kidding. So like that slide, which Frank showed us a little while ago, there's not just low levels of income, there's a lot of volatility in the incomes that the poor have. It's not that they're getting $1 every day. And so it's equally important potentially to look at how this is playing out in their head and how it's occupying bandwidth. And so in some work that I've been doing with Guilherme Lechand, we've been looking at what are the effects of income volatility on IQ, and therefore, the implication being that this could have a big effect on decision making. So as development economists, which many of us in this set of presenters are, the canonical example of risk is lack of rain. It's bad rainfall outcomes which you have no control over. It has a huge impact in many, many parts of the world. And the part of the world that we are doing our work is in Brazil. So that's the place where we're doing our work. This is the Ceará region of northeast Brazil. It's one of the most drought-prone regions in the country. And our work is set in about 47 cities, in municipalities, really. I don't know what the exact word is that they use in that setting. And so let me tell you what we're doing in the context of this work. We would like to study the effects of the risk that people face with drought. Now, of course, we can't randomly assign that, but what we do have control over, in the spirit of some of these mechanism experiments that Jens Ludwig and others have been doing, is that the worries about what if you end up with a drought is something that we can assign randomly. And how do we do that? We basically prime people to worry about facing a drought in that particular year. So this is what we ask them. We do this over automated phone calls. And then what we do at the same time is that we have daily data on the actual rainfall shocks in each of these municipalities. So it could be a good shock or it could be a bad shock. And therefore, what we're doing is that we have what I would call a 2x2 design, and we are trying to benchmark what we see in terms of our very lab-style thing where we're making people worry with what is actually going on in terms of the rain that they're getting day by day over the course of the 4 months of the rainy season when we track them. And sort of there are, the reason to do both of these things together is that there are pros and cons of doing each of these. With the priming, we have much more control over, when we see a particular outcome, it's driven by what we as individuals are when we prime these individual farmers. Whereas with the actual rainfall shocks, it's really what's actually happening in their lives. We have, of course, it's much more noisy, but it gives us some external validity in terms of that what we see here is in fact real. And we are doing it to the same set of farmers, so that we are tracking both things in parallel. And what do we find here? So we first look at worry, and we find that being primed on this phone call, where I call them, I start off the phone call by some variant of, what will you do if you face a drought this year? We find that it does increase their worry. And if, in fact, in the last 30 days, the rain that they have got has been very bad, and then we prime them, then it has a much bigger impact. And how does this compare with the number of dry days that they have actually faced in the last 7 days? We find that it's very, fairly similar to the effect of the priming itself. So this is in terms of the worry. And now, what does this mean in terms of their cognitive load? So we have a bunch of cognitive load tests that we gave them over the phone. And we see that both in terms of the priming itself and what's happened in terms of the number of dry days where they had no rain in the last 7 days, it has a big impact. One interesting thing which I didn't put here is that what's happened in the last 30 days, unless it doesn't seem to have a big effect on their cognitive load. It's what happened in the last 7 days that really seems to sort of be front and center and have an actual impact in their cognitive load. And so the thing that we've been doing, which we did as part of this, is that we in fact did offer insurance. Now the thing is that the insurance that we offered is what's called index insurance, which means it's not based on what happens to an individual farmer, but it's based on the gap between what's the projected crop for the season in their area and what the actual for the municipality as a whole turns out to be. And we found that, in fact, the insurance, index insurance, doesn't seem to do a whole lot in terms of mitigating people's cognitive load. We have some evidence based on all the individual level, so municipality level as well, data that we collected, that some of this has to do with whether people trust that this thing will pay out or not, because they have no reason to believe that it does. There's another 7-year study by Mark Tobacman and Sean Cole and others, which sort of looks at how farmers' demand for index insurance is very sensitive to payouts. So you don't trust it potentially. So right now, what we are working on is how can we improve this insurance design. We are sort of trying different designs of this and going to roll it out in the field in the fall this year. That's where we are with that. So I'm going to summarize by saying, what do I take away from what I've learned with these studies in Kenya and Brazil in terms of how poverty is affecting willpower and how volatility is having an impact? I think that we do have, from Kenya, evidence that poverty does deplete willpower based on the delay in how long they're willing to wait for the transfer, and somewhat counterintuitive implication that give the poor money when they have a little money, not when they have nothing, and they may use it better. We still need to do more work on finding good policy tools to deal with the effects of income volatility, and that's what we're working on with insurance design. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Anandi. So next we have Heather Schofield talking about more about the psychological lives of the poor and about other factors that may be impacting people's bandwidth. Coming up short.
Okay, so I'm just going to jump right in to save some time. Today I'm going to be building a bit on Anandi's discussion of scarcity effects and liquidity effects with a bit of a broader discussion of what we know about the cognitive lives of the poor and why it might be valuable to think about the lives of the poor through this lens of cognition and psychology rather than just money itself. So as we just saw, that scarcity can really impede cognition in important ways, such as reducing willpower. But poverty is really a very complex state. And there are many aspects kind of beyond this kind of constant set of trade-offs that we might want to be thinking about. Which really brings us to the central question I'll be asking today, which is how should we think about the psychological lives of the poor in this broader sense? So today I'm going to talk a bit about how we can measure this psychological life, what other factors might be influencing it, and how it can help us understand outcomes that we might care about, either as economists or from a policy point of view. And to do that, I'm going to use a kind of central conceptual and empirical tool, which I'm going to refer to as bandwidth, which is a topic I'm sure many of you are familiar with, and which I'll get into more details on a bit later. But before doing that, I'm going to start with a motivating example to get us off. The first thing that I'm going to talk about is nutrition. And this is a topic that if you go back and forth between developed countries, like here at HBS with our amazing spread outside this room, and developing countries like India, you'll see enormous differences. So it's extremely striking when you travel to places like India just how small and underweight many of the individuals are. So for example, I was on a bus in the Philippines once, and the guy sitting next to me looks over and he says, "You're taking 2 seats." And it wasn't mean, it wasn't malicious, it was just fair. It was a true assessment of the situation. And this is driven in large part by kind of low caloric intake. And it results in very kind of striking differences, not just from my perception, but also kind of in true fact. So the average Indian adult today is 5 foot 3 inches tall and weighs 115 pounds, which is roughly the same weight as the average adult male in Europe in the 1700s or an 11-year-old in the US today. So incredibly striking differences. And as economists, we actually have some pretty good ways about thinking of this problem. So we all know that eating is pleasant, being hungry is unpleasant, food is a normal good, it enters your utility function. And we also know that eating too little makes you feel tired and weak. At some very basic level, you need energy to be productive. Your heart needs to beat, you need to breathe. But there's a third way to think about this problem that I don't think either economists or policymakers have thought about nearly as much, which is that food may also enter into your psychological life or your cognitive life. You need energy for your brain to function as well. And since this is a bit of a counterintuitive idea, I think right off the bat in this environment, let me motivate it by going back to a very old study from the 1940s. So as you can tell from the timing in the 1940s, this is right around the timing of the Second World War, and there was a lot of interest in understanding the effects of malnutrition because there were a lot of, say, prisoners of war and the like who had been starved during this period. So some researchers in Minnesota decided to recruit conscientious objectors to the war and asked them to semi-starve themselves for 6 months, such that they lost about 25% of their body weight during this time. And during this time, they followed very closely everything that happened to them physiologically, physically, and cognitively. And then they asked them to follow different rehabilitation diets and tracked the same sets of outcomes. And they found some really interesting results, not just on the physiological and physical side, but also in terms of what was happening to these individuals cognitively and psychologically. So just to give you a few motivating examples, let me read you a few of these quotes, which I find really quite striking. So the first is, the acquisition of food-related items was a reasonable extension of their heightened interest in food. Much less reasonable was the buying of old books, unnecessary secondhand clothes, knickknacks, and other junk. Often after making such purchases, which could only be afforded with sacrifice, the men would be puzzled as to why they had bought such more or less useless articles. Or, then came the day when I lost my will to activity. I no longer cared to do anything that required energy. The days began to drag. There is nothing that can hold my interest for long. I wait for mealtime. We can see these changes that are happening in the cognitive space as well as the physical space. And it raises a lot of questions. What do we mean by mental function? Do these effects exist in other contexts? Say the levels of caloric intake we see around the world today, are they big? Would they have other consequences? So I started to explore some of these questions in a randomized trial in India fairly recently, about 2 years ago. And in this randomized trial, I recruited about 200 cycle rickshaw drivers, which you can think of as a bicycle taxi. And half of them were provided with an extra 700 calories of food every day. And they ate that extra 700 calories for 5 weeks. And all the participants, both treatment and control, were asked to do a battery of physical and cognitive tasks at the beginning and end of the study to measure their cognitive and physical function. Just to give you a sense of what some of these might be, on the cognitive side, this is one of the tasks as an example. Participants were given 40 pages of grids that looked like that, and they were asked to cross out all the examples of the symbols that occur at the top up here in the grid below. And they're paid for every correctly crossed out symbol and kind of penalized for every incorrectly crossed out symbol. And as you can tell from how boring the description of that task is, it's excruciating. It's pretty taxing, and it just is a kind of a mental persistence task. Can you just keep going when you're really mentally tired? And what you can see is, in fact, the treated participants did do better. And they saw a pretty immediate 12% improvement in their performance on these tasks. And that gain was sustained over the 5 weeks of the study. Now, of course, this is a pretty artificial environment. People aren't actually out there crossing out symbols for their productive careers. And so there's an open question of, does this then translate to other outcomes that we might care about in the real world? And we studied some of those outcomes as well. So to give you an example of that, you can think about trading off effort across time. This is something that the rickshaw drivers actually have to do in their everyday lives. They have to decide, do I take trips today or do I take them sometime in the future to earn money for me and my family? So they were offered the choice between not taking a trip and earning nothing, taking one of their trips today with a 100-kilo load and earning 30 rupees tomorrow, or taking a heavier trip tomorrow for the same pay. So what they're doing is they're trading off pushing the work into the future against making it more difficult. And what you can see is that the treated participants are more likely to actually engage today, to put in that effort rather than pushing it off into the future and making it more costly for themselves. So there's a real change in their kind of discount rate, their effort discounting, and an outcome that we actually care about. Okay, so this example then kind of highlights a number of important aspects of the discussion I'd like to have today. So let me walk through those. The first is we can talk about how to measure psychological life and actually fairly kind of measurable and concrete ways that are fairly simple to administer. The second is that there are a lot of factors which might influence cognitive or psychological lives beyond just poverty itself. There are a lot of these factors associated with poverty, like malnutrition, sleep deprivation, pain, which can influence cognition and these long-run decisions that we're interested in. And the third is that it may help us then understand some of these outcomes through a new lens. We might not have necessarily thought to consider some of these other kind of underlying factors like pain, but if we think about their impact on cognition and decision making, we can see that it's a very important thing to be considering. And so what we'll do is I'll talk a bit about this kind of tool that we can use to measure cognition, bandwidth, and walk through these in a bit more detail. But before doing that, let me just literally put up a picture of exactly what I'm talking about to hopefully make this a little more visual and tractable. What we'll be thinking about is all these different factors over here, which are often associated with poverty, how they can feed in kind of the central conceptual tool, bandwidth, cognition, the psychological lives of the poor, and then how that might influence these outcomes that we care about, either as economists or as policymakers. People's productivity in the labor market, their decisions that they're making, and their utility, their actual experiences. Okay, so what is bandwidth? I've been talking about this as kind of a general abstract tool. And in fact, in some ways it is. It's psychological scope, this ability to kind of manage your psychological lives. And that's an abstraction, but it's actually a very useful abstraction. So to see that, think about an analogy to human capital. Human capital is also this kind of general, kind of broader concept of our ability to be productive in the labor market, but it really serves a useful purpose, a tool to kind of conceptualize this aspect of life. And the same thing is true of bandwidth. It's this kind of psychological scope, and it has these subcomponents that we can talk about. So in fact, there are two underlying subcomponents of bandwidth. The first is cognitive capacity, which is our set of kind of basic cognitive abilities, such as memory, attention, or reasoning. And the second is executive control, which is our ability to manage these underlying functions. And there are a number of key points about bandwidth, this kind of broad topic. And I'm going to walk through these each one by one, because I think they're important enough to merit a bit of discussion. The first is that bandwidth is malleable and may be impeded by many factors that are associated with poverty. So we saw this with nutrition, but it's actually a much broader idea. The second is that it's measurable, and that third, it can affect decisions. And then finally, a bit more speculatively, it may influence these other outcomes that we're interested in, productivity and utility. Okay. So as I was saying, there are a lot of different factors that may be associated with poverty that may limit people's bandwidth. And the evidence on these ranges quite substantially. So there's some which have quite good evidence. So Frank's work on alcohol, poverty itself, which we've just seen some evidence on. And then there's some which are kind of much more kind of ongoing and speculative, but in process. So a number of us are working on studies about understanding how physical pain or sleep deprivation might influence cognition and decision making, as well as productivity in the labor market. And then there are a number of kind of much more open factors which nobody's really considered in a systematic way, but have the same potential importance, such as noise or heat. I think one other kind of important thing to mention about this is that this list is not exhaustive. I've put up a number of different factors which may be important, but I think looking at this question of kind of thinking about this lens of bandwidth may highlight a lot of other factors which aren't on this list, but which we should be studying. So for example, pollution. We could imagine that that influences your cognitive abilities and these other downstream outcomes that we care about, but it isn't something that economists or policymakers might necessarily think about through that lens and through all the kind of diverse impacts that it might have. Okay. I think the other thing to mention about this is, of course, that a lot more evidence is actually necessary. So although there is this ongoing work and there's some evidence on certain factors, there are a lot of these other factors out there which we know very little about and which more evidence would help us understand the potential impacts of these upstream influences. Luckily, though, there are a lot of different ways to actually measure bandwidth, and it's pretty straightforward to do, which will facilitate studying these upstream outcomes and their downstream impacts. So since we're fairly short on time today, I'm not going to go through these tests in detail, but I did want to highlight a few kind of common themes about the various tests that you can use to measure bandwidth. The first is that they tend to be fairly broadly applicable. So think back to the example that I gave you in the nutrition study. There are these grids, you cross out these symbols. Anybody can do that. You don't need to have schooling, you don't need to have any kind of formal institutional knowledge. You can explain this to individuals and they're able to carry it out fairly easily. And the second is that they can be fairly easily administered and instructed. So although that task took quite a while to administer, many of these tasks are fairly quick. They take about 3 to 5 minutes, and they can be done on a portable electronic tablet. So the data can be collected at scale and with kind of minimal instruction periods. And importantly, to understanding the impacts that bandwidth has on these downstream outcomes that we're interested in, we can actually manipulate as well bandwidth itself and measure the manipulation that we've had, the impact that we've had. And in fact, this is really quite commonly done in the psychological literature. And it's so commonly done that it has its own name, cognitive load, which is this idea of loading or taxing this kind of central resource of bandwidth. And this can be done in a variety of different ways. So you can ask people to remember large digit numbers. You can have imposed time pressure. You can rely on natural variation in things like when you feel awake or sleepy. And a lot has been done to understand then how this change in bandwidth, this tax or this load, influences the decisions that people have made. And much of this has been done in labs, say in the US, with college students and the like. But it is a very robust literature that does suggest that there are pretty large impacts of reducing people's bandwidth or their kind of psychological scope on their decision making, these outcomes that we care about. So I'm going to give you just one quick example to give you a sense of the types of things that people have studied in this space. So I'm going to give you this example because I think it's kind of nice for its simplicity. I should caveat it with that the magnitude of the effects aren't usually this large, but it's a kind of cute example. So in this study, the experimenters manipulate the kind of bandwidth that people have or the load that's exerted on their brains by having them hold either a 2 or a 7-digit number in their head. They then have the students walk down the hall and they have to make a decision between a very tempting piece of chocolate cake with cherries on top and a very virtuous piece of fruit. And what you see is that, in fact, when they have this low burden, they're much more likely to choose the fruit than when they have to remember the high digit number. When they're taxed, they make a much more kind of temptation-based decision than they do when they're not taxed or loaded. And more generally, we see in this literature that when you tax individuals, when you take away this bandwidth or this scope, they tend to make kind of much more, their decision-making becomes impaired. They have more trouble with prospective memory, impulse control, and in making reasoned judgments. And importantly, you don't see such large effects on things which are not these kind of much more reasoned decisions, on things like social preferences, which is suggestive that in fact it is about this underlying bandwidth that people have to make choices. Okay. So although we have pretty good evidence that in fact bandwidth influences poverty or decision-making, there's much more open about how bandwidth influences people's productivity and their utility. There are these other outcomes that we care about that we know less about. And although we know less about them, and I don't have a lot of evidence to present, I think it is worth highlighting how they could matter to show why this is such an important area to consider. So to do that, let me take just a minute and talk about utility and how we might think about utility in a very different light through this new lens. So the traditional view in thinking about kind of poverty and utility is that poverty will reduce utility because you're consuming less. I think we can all agree on that. That seems pretty intuitive. But there's this new view that we could think about through this lens of bandwidth, which is that poverty may also reduce utility of a given consumption bundle. This is a little counterintuitive. In fact, it's very opposite of most economics predictions. So take a moment and think about it. Think about the last time you were stressed out and busy and running around like crazy. Not that any of you would do this, but just imagine you binged watched House of Cards or you ate a bunch of donuts. Did you enjoy that? Probably not a lot. It's pretty hard to enjoy that when you're feeling so taxed. So you could imagine that, in fact, this kind of poverty, this bandwidth tax, might impede your ability to enjoy what consumption you do have. And again, there's not much evidence on this, but there's some interesting suggestive indications. So let me go back to the Minnesota experiment to show you some of that. So I told you that the researchers studied a lot of different outcomes in this study. One thing that they studied was how much people enjoyed a variety of different activities, eating, sex, and just general activity kind of around and about. And not surprisingly, you can see that as you get more and more hungry, you enjoy food more and more, you think about it a lot. And then as you kind of follow the rehab diets, that goes away. But interestingly, sex and interest in other activities goes down as you get hungrier. There's this spillover effect of having this reduced consumption, this reduced bandwidth, to your enjoyment of other activities. In fact, you may be reducing utility not just because you have less, but because you're enjoying that less as well. Okay, so you may now very reasonably be asking yourselves, what does this have to do with poverty? In fact, you could see a lot of these lab studies in the US or the examples I just gave you about utility as being kind of very general phenomena, and they are. But there are reasons that we might actually think about this very specifically in poverty and having more relevance there. The first is that the effects may be greater for the poor. So the poor have kind of greater exposure to many of these factors which may limit bandwidth. They sleep worse, they're in more chronic pain, they're more likely to be malnourished. They have fewer safety nets and more substantial consequences to the decisions that they make. And importantly, money may be a very important substitute for bandwidth. So think about sleep deprivation. If you have a lot of money, you can buy yourself a nice air-conditioned house with a comfortable mattress and you can sleep well. If you're poor, that's much less the case. You may be taxed in that way. Also, I think thinking about poverty through this lens allows us to understand the lives of the poor by how poverty affects bandwidth. So again, it will highlight a lot of these different things that we might not have thought about before and put them in a new light. Nutrition is something we're already thinking about as development economists because it's in the canon of the kind of literature. But other things like alcohol or heat or noise or pain are not things that fall in that category, but are still very important. And thinking about this lens helps us see that. And as was mentioned earlier, it also helps to highlight the possibility of these feedback loops. So this was something that Frank was bringing up. The poverty can reduce bandwidth, which can lead to impediments in productivity and decision-making, which can feed back into poverty. This isn't to say that there are traps. There may or may not be traps, but it could certainly create these feedback loops, which make it harder to escape poverty. Finally, this lens helps us understand how some choices and outcomes we already care about can be influenced by bandwidth. It gives us a new perspective on things that we're already thinking about, like productivity. So to see that, let me take a moment and just highlight one of them, which is technology adoption. This is something that we've cared about a lot in development economics for a long time and from a policy point of view. And we have a lot of ways of thinking about this already. We can think of learning by doing, social learning, credit constraints. But in fact, bandwidth actually underlies all of these things that we're already thinking about in this space. So for example, in order to learn by doing, you need to understand how to use the technology. You need to remember the instructions. You may need to have self-control and have planning in order to save to take up this technology. All of these are things that are kind of part and parcel that go along with this bandwidth function. You need that in order to kind of have these other approaches. And that's true of many other issues as well. It's not just technology adoption. It's credit, education, health, all these other things that we care about from a development and policy point of view. Okay, so with that, let me start to wrap up. I've highlighted a lot about what we already do know, and the evidence really does suggest that bandwidth is this very useful construct in the middle of thinking about kind of downstream factors and upstream consequences. So it's very central to our understanding of poverty. But there are a lot of things which are still not known. And I've started to foreshadow some of these questions, but I just wanted to reemphasize that because I think it's a very rich area for kind of further research and further evidence. So we might need more further evidence on kind of these causes of bandwidth. It's not just some of the ones that I've highlighted, but other ones which may be out there as well. And more evidence on the consequences of bandwidth. We've seen some impacts on decision-making in the lab, on productivity in the field, but what about utility and some of the questions that we highlighted there? And how kind of to measure these very diffuse effects. It's a good, if we see decision-making changes in the lab, how do they show up in the field? Where do they show up in the field? Can we measure all of them and aggregate them in some useful ways? Okay, so let me just wrap up then and say, hopefully I've convinced you that bandwidth is actually a very useful kind of conceptual and empirical construct to think about the psychological or cognitive lives of the poor. And that it's very kind of central in their lives. It can be it's malleable and can be influenced. And it matters to these other outcomes that we care about, but that we have a lot more to do to really understand the role that it's going to play in their lives. Okay, thank you.
Great, thanks so much, Heather. So next is Anu Shah, who will tell us about his expertise on the expertise of the poor.
All right, great. So thank you all for being here. And this is joint work with Eldar Shafir and Sandal Mulianathan. And of course, the big theme of this session has been really, well, how should we think about the minds of the poor? What do we know about what's on their minds? And I think, the truth is that if we're really being honest with ourselves, then most lay intuitions, maybe even our own intuitions, are that the poor don't have very much mind at all. And so Ananda alluded to some of this. Let me show you a little bit more data on this. And this comes from some impressive work by Susan Fisk and Amy Cuddy, where they asked groups of people in the US to tell you basically how they view groups of people in the country along two dimensions. How smart or competent do people seem, and how warm or kind do people seem? And whenever you see a chart like this, of course, the first thing you do is try to find yourself on it to say, okay, where am I on this chart? But while you're doing that, of course, one of the things that really jumps out to you is that most people in the US tend to have a very low opinion of poor individuals. They tend to rate them as among the least competent groups in the country. And there are lots of reasons why people might point to justify these beliefs. And we've already started to talk about a lot of the disparities that you see. So people might point to this long list and say, look at all of these mistakes that poor individuals make. Of course I'm going to think they're less competent. And that leads you then one version of how people think about the minds of the poor, which are, well, some people are smart, some people are less smart. Perhaps it's not surprising that the less smart people end up making lots of mistakes that lead them to become poor. But as Ananda suggested, well, maybe sometimes the causality actually runs in the other direction, right? So what we know is that, in fact, poverty can also impede cognitive function, as she's shown in many studies, including the sugarcane farm, which you are all familiar with now. And as startling as this result is, I mean, I think there's something about it that still kind of satisfies our intuition, which is regardless of whether we think the causality runs in one direction or the other, we still keep coming back to the same narrative, which is that the poor are somehow thinking less, or that the cognitive function is impeded. And so we keep coming back to this old narrative that the poor have less mind, or that they're thinking less, but that doesn't actually tell us very much about what's on their mind, what are they thinking about. And to get to that, to start building out that narrative, I actually have to show you one more mistake that the poor actually make more often than the wealthy do. And to appreciate this mistake, I actually have to tell you about one of my favorite studies in the history of cognitive psychology. And so I think this is actually super interesting, but I have to warn you that what we cognitive psychologists find interesting, the rest of the world may not, okay? And so for this study actually has a beautiful and straightforward simplicity to it. It starts with you simply just reading lists of words to participants. So you might show them a list that includes words like rest, awake, slumber, snooze, and so on. Or you might show them a list of words that includes things like male, uncle, son, father, etc. And this really is a simple study, because after you read each word list to people, immediately after you read it to them, you simply just ask them to recall as many words as they can. And in general, people do a pretty good job, because this is not a hard task. So people say, okay, I saw rest, I saw awake, that's great. I saw male, I saw uncle, terrific. But then something weird happens, which is that depending on the word list, about 20 to 50% of people will say that they heard or saw a very specific word that was never presented at all. So for the word list on the left, people will say, well, I heard the word sleep. But that can't be, because we never said it. For the word list on the right, people say, I saw the word man. That's impossible, because we never showed it to you. And so if you're like me, at first blush, these word lists seem kind of magical, and I often pull them out at dinner parties to impress people, and then I'm never invited back again. But these are of course not magic, right? You see why these word lists work. They work because they're not just random collections of words, right? Or at least we don't see them as random. So male is connected to son, is connected to uncle, is connected to father, and all those words weave together across a common concept, which is man. And so now that you see this, you might wonder, okay, what does this actually tell us about the minds of the poor, the psychological lives of the poor? Well, just imagine a slightly different word list, a list that includes words like rent, loan, groceries, utilities. Now that you know the basic effect, I'm sure that many of you see lurking in here the one word that binds all of these together, which is money. Especially if you're used to constantly asking yourself about these expenses, each of these words calls to mind an overwhelming question, which is, well, how am I going to pay for these things? How am I going to afford these things? But on the other hand, if you're not used to thinking about these expenses, or you don't think about them in the same breath as each other, then maybe you won't see this word lurking here. Maybe this actually will feel like a random collection of words. And so for the first study that we ran, we simply just showed participants this word list, a list of words that are related to the word money, but we never show them the word money. And we also show them what I'll call our control word list, a list of words that are related to the word man, but we never show them the word man. And so we simply just present these to people visually, and then it takes about 30 seconds to show them the words, and then immediately after showing them the words, we just say, write down as many words as you remember seeing. And then we ask them, what is your household income, and how many people live in your household? And we divide their household income by the square root of the household size. And I'm going to show you participants' responses based on a median split of that metric, but we analyze it continuously in case that's of interest. And so then what we can do is look to say, okay, what are the false intrusion rates or the false memory rates? What percentage of people are saying that they saw the word man or saw the word money even though it wasn't presented? And I think this graph is kind of interesting. So first of all, for the man-related word list, you see that there aren't really any differences between wealthier individuals and poorer individuals. There's similar false intrusion rates of about 16% to 18%. But where you do see a far more meaningful difference is for the money-related word list. You see that lower-income individuals are far more likely to say that they saw the word money even though it was never presented. And I'm hoping that you don't have to be a cognitive psychologist to find this graph interesting because, look, the truth is we all have to juggle expenses like this, and yet for some of us, we're lucky enough to be able to see these things as actually unrelated or random words. But for poor individuals, that word list, it takes on a different texture. Each of the words reminds them of the one thing that isn't there, which is money. So then you can imagine that there might be a lot of situations where, for those of us in this room, many of us are lucky enough, where money might be the last thing to come to mind for us, but it might be the first thing to come to mind for the poor. And so let me give you one example of that. So in the next study to see whether, in fact, money is top of mind, whether the poor focus on expenses more often in situations where other people do not, we asked people to imagine all being in a situation that, unfortunately, at some point, most of us will be in at one point or another. So we asked them to imagine being sick. And the doctor tells you that you're seriously ill, but the good news is you're going to make a full recovery. You just need to see the doctor a few more times and take a few prescriptions. And so then we asked participants to simply just tell us what would be on their mind or how would they feel as they imagine doing this. And we asked them to summarize the first three thoughts that come to mind with one word each. So basically, what are the first three words that come to mind? And I was kind of surprised. I thought participants wouldn't take this very seriously, but participants all gave pretty serious responses to this. So some people mentioned the important people in their lives. So one participant said, I'd be thinking about my wife, my son, my coworker. I'm not sure how the wife and son feel about the coworker being in the picture, but it's one way to respond. Many more people talked about what they would feel, the emotional aspect of this. So they'd say, well, I'm scared, I'm worried. We can all relate to that. Other people said, well, the doctor said I'm going to be okay, so there's some relief, there's some hope, there's joy. But still, a smaller fraction of participants mentioned a far more practical concern, which is they said, when the doctor tells me I'm sick, I'd be thinking about how much this is going to cost me. What's the cost of being sick? I'd be thinking about my finances, the expenses, and so on. So I don't know if you're like me, if I were in this situation, this would be a deeply emotional experience for me, finding out that I was seriously ill. And in fact, this is a fairly emotional experience for most people. So you have about 90% of people mentioning at least one emotion-related word, and that does not vary by income. But where you do see a meaningful difference by income is on who's mentioning that more practical concern on cost. And you see that lower income individuals are far more likely to say that they're thinking about money than are wealthier individuals. And in hindsight, this might be a little bit obvious, okay, poor people think about money more. If I had come in here and told you wealthy people think about money more, you would have believed that as well, but that's not what we see. But think about why this is important in this context. Because in this context, going to the doctor almost becomes like a dichotic listening task for the poor. In one ear, they're hearing everything the doctor is actually saying. You're sick, here's the potential diagnosis, here's what we're going to do about it. But in the other ear, they're hearing all these other things. This is what it's going to cost me. What am I going to do to get this money, even when all of those things go unsaid? And so then think about why there's worse medical adherence. One possibility is simply less of it's getting through in that meeting with the doctor, or there's just a lot more anxiety about going to see the doctor and finding out, here's this new list of bills that you weren't anticipating before. Now, Ananda talked a little bit about whether insurance can alleviate some of these concerns, and she says she doesn't find evidence of it because they don't know whether to believe this insurance will actually pay off or not. But there actually is a place where you don't see this pattern, which is in the UK. So when you run this on a larger sample of people in the US and in the UK, you don't find that poor individuals in the UK are likely to think about money when they're seeing the doctor because they have nationalized health insurance. So now you can start to think about ways in which insurance might alleviate some of these bandwidth concerns. So we start here, and then you look at my title slide, and you said, Anuj, your title slide was the expertise of the poor, and all of this does not look like expertise. It looks like them making another cognitive mistake, them being distracted when they're talking to the doctor. So where does this expertise come from, or why are you calling this the expertise of the poor? Well, let's think about where these thoughts come from and why money might be top of mind for the poor, and that will lead us to actually understanding a little bit of what this expertise looks like. So what's one model of what the poor are thinking about or how income affects our thoughts? Well, so I'm not an economist, so I don't use math. I use clip art to develop my models. Okay, I'm a psychologist. And so one version of how scarcity or poverty might affect what's on our mind comes as follows. So one of the things which is true is that when you're poor, you lack money. And when you lack money, many expenses start to accumulate. And so there's a question of, well, how am I going to pay for all of these things? My gas, my phone bill, the mortgage on my neon pink house, how am I going to pay for these things? And now, when you're poor, there's one more question that you have to ask yourself. Or when you're short on money, there's one more question you have to ask yourself, which is not just what am I going to buy, but another question is, if I pay for this, what am I going to give up? Right? You have to think about trade-offs. And so none of these are one-off expenses. Instead, each of these calls to mind the other expenses that are there, and they make you think of the dimension along which you have to constantly compare these things. And so to put it differently, you can say, well, the poor are often thinking about trade-offs or thinking about opportunity costs. And what's interesting is that for those of us in this room, those opportunity costs are always there. In an economic sense, an economist would say they're always there, but they don't always become a psychological reality. So for me, if I start my day with a $4 cup of coffee, that really feels like a totally different thing, unrelated to all my other expenses. And so even though those opportunity costs are there in an economic sense, they're not there in a psychological sense. And so this is important, this is interesting, because this now moves us beyond the thought that, oh, the poor are just thinking less, and it tells us a little bit about what they're thinking about. They're thinking about these trade-offs and these opportunity costs. And this, in some sense, is the way that we should all be thinking according to economists. So now, this might actually lead us to see some expertise among how the poor make decisions. So let me offer you a couple glimpses of what that expertise looks like. So to appreciate one version of this expertise, we can say, okay, are there certain behavioral biases or malleability in decisions that goes away when you're poor? And to get a handle on this, let's take a little bit of a mental field trip, and let's imagine that you're on a beach on a hot summer day and all you're really craving is an ice cold beer. And you have a friend with you who says, okay, I'll go buy that beer for you. You just give me the money, I'll pay for it, I'll bring you the change, and I'll bring you the beer. You just sit right here. So that's the kind of friend you keep around in life, right? Somebody to do your bidding, okay? And this is, of course, a classic example that Thaler came up with in 1985, which highlights some of the most fundamental principles of behavioral science. So what do? Well, imagine one version of the universe where your friend says, I'm going to buy this beer from a small rundown grocery store. Imagine another version of the universe where your friend says, I'm going to buy this beer from a fancy resort. And so you can imagine in which situation you might be willing to pay more for this beer, right? But what's interesting is that really you ought to be able to look at this beer and know exactly what it's worth. It should not depend on where it's being purchased. You should know what this beer is worth to you, what is its value. But that's a hard question to ask yourself. Buying this beer does not meaningfully change your lives, at least not monetarily. And so asking what is this beer worth to you in isolation would be a bit like if I showed you this orange circle and I asked you how precisely orange is this? How would you even go about answering that, right? Or if I asked you, what is the precise diameter of the circle? Maybe some of you can tell me that, but most of us can't, because we're not well equipped to answer questions like this in isolation. We're not well equipped to make judgments of color or size or even value in absolute terms. We're much better at making comparative judgments. We're much better at making judgments like this. So are these circles the same shade of orange? Yes. Are they the same size? Yes. And if you had trouble with that, please see me afterwards. Okay, we're going to work on that. But what's interesting is that because we often make comparisons to guide our judgments, well, when the comparison standards change, so do our judgments. So we know these circles are identical, but now when the comparison standards change, so do our judgments. Now, all of a sudden, the circle on the right seems larger than the circle on the left. And even though this is a visual illusion, it highlights something fundamental about how we make judgments, which is we often look to the context. And when the context changes, so do our judgments. And that is a basic principle of behavioral science. We are not well equipped to make judgments in absolute terms. We make comparative judgments. So what does this have to do with the beer and the beach problem? What does this have to do with the minds of the poor? Well, now just think about when you're trying to evaluate what this beer is worth. What is this beer worth? You can't answer that. You have to know what is this beer worth compared to what. So if I tell you it's coming from a fancy resort, you say, oh, I'm going to pay a lot more for it. If you say it's coming from a grocery store, you say, I'm going to pay less for it. Right? And as relatable as that is, that's a mistake. But for poor individuals, you don't see that mistake, because when they're thinking about what is this beer worth, they know compared to what? Well, compared to all these other expenses. And these expenses do not change based on whether these trade-offs do not change based on whether you're going to the resort or the grocery store. And so you might actually expect them to have a more stable sense of what this beer is worth. So do we see evidence of that? So we surveyed a bunch of people. We asked them, before we asked them to tell us what this beer is worth to them, we said, what are you thinking about as you're making this judgment? And we give them a bunch of response options. And the interesting question that we're interested in is, are they thinking about trade-offs, or are they thinking about where the beer is being purchased? And you see that wealthier individuals are far more likely to say that they're thinking about where the beer is being purchased, which sets up that mistake. Poor individuals are far more likely to say, I'm thinking about trade-offs, what I can't buy if I buy this beer. And because of that, they are less susceptible to the framing here. So wealthier individuals show you the usual effect. They say, I'll pay more for the beer from the resort than from the grocery store. That effect is muted for lower income individuals. And it's not just because the poor can't afford it or because they don't know it costs more at the resort. They know those things. It's not about being able to afford it. It's that they have a more stable sense of what it's worth because they have comparison standards that guide those judgments. So you can even see this in another context. So to adapt a classic scenario from Kennan and Tversky, imagine that you're buying a laptop that costs $300, and the salesperson, who is not a very good salesperson, tells you another store has it for cheaper 30 minutes away for $50 cheaper. And the question is, will you travel 30 minutes to save $50? You can imagine, well, $50 off of 300, that feels like a pretty good sized discount. So sure, I'll travel 30 minutes to save 50 bucks. But now imagine that the laptop costs $500 or $1,000. As the laptop costs more and more, that $50 discount feels smaller and smaller. And so you say, well, I'm not going to travel for a $50 discount off $1,000. That's a waste of time. But that's a mistake too, because if you value your time at 30 minutes for 50 bucks, that should be true regardless of what the laptop costs. But that's not usually what happens. People say, well, is $50 a lot compared to what? And as you change the comparison standards, so do their judgments. But that's not true for the poor. Again, you ask them, what are you thinking about as you're making this judgment? They say, I'm thinking about what I cannot buy if I do not save this $50. Wealthier individuals are saying, well, I'm thinking about whether $50 represents a large enough percentage discount. So because of that, you see, again, the usual effect with wealthier individuals, which is they're more willing to travel for the discount when it comes off of 300 than off of 1,000, but that effect is muted for lower income individuals. And I should say we've replicated the beer on the beach and this one on a nationally representative sample of about 2,000 people as well. So it's not just Mechanical Turk participants, it's real human beings as well. And so I think what this, where does this take us when we start to think about the minds of the poor? Well, we started with this notion and this fact, which is that being poor taxes mental bandwidth. Now we can start to paint the picture in a little bit more detail and say, well, what are they thinking about? We see that in some ways, being poor actually forces you to focus. You have to focus a lot more on everyday expenses. And because of that, that sometimes leads to smarter decisions. But now, imagine yourself at the end of a day of doing these two bullet points. You can imagine just how tired you're going to be. If you're constantly juggling these expenses, that is mentally occupying. That is mentally draining. And so now you can imagine that this expertise itself might be the thing that feeds back and taxes mental bandwidth. So that then leaves us with the question about what do we do with the bandwidth problem facing the poor. One of the nice things about the Give Directly work that Ananda is doing is it suggests that even if you hold constant the amount of money that you're giving, well, you can see that there are times when there's more bandwidth or less bandwidth. But all of this, what this all does is push us back to think about, well, how should we think about the minds of the poor? And go back to that first slide, which is, well, why do we often think that the poor are thinking less? Or why do we assume that they're not competent? I think a lot of times it's because we're looking for a mindset or a thought process that resembles ours. And so when we see the poor making a mistake, we say, well, they must just be trying to do what we're doing, but they're doing it less well. In fact, these results suggest that maybe they're in fact focusing on different things, and there's an expertise that emerges, but that we overlook because we're often looking for a different kind of thought process. So that's where we'll leave off, and I think we have time for questions for all of us, yeah? Great. All right, thanks. Can you answer questions from any of us, any of the broader things that came up? Yeah, please.
Yeah, so question specifically for you. So Rafe Mazer with CGAP, we work on financial inclusion. So the point you just made that having economic scarcity can lead you to smarter financial decisions, and that's sort of a context we need to understand. But where do you integrate in the context of how the channel through which something is delivered or the way in which it's framed? I'll give you an example. So yeah, I would agree with your hypothesis, especially in the country I live in Kenya. But then we also have these new loans coming through mobile phones, and what I've seen through my research is that lower income people will use them for good things like malaria medicine for the children when they don't have the capital, and that's good. That's expensive credit used for productive output.
Right.
But also the fact that it comes through SMS and it has a kind of gamified feel to it, people will just take out a loan and then not use it and maybe later use it on airtime, and they just paid 7.5% a month to finance talk time. So I think there is the context of poverty, but there's also the context of delivery channels and framing. So
I think we want to repeat all the questions, so I'm just repeating it for the thing. But so the question basically is, okay, so how should we think about the delivery channels and the framing of this? And maybe if I can twist the question a little bit, so how do we use the framing and the delivery channels to actually draw on the expertise or the shift in thought process? And so one thing that you mentioned was, look, so the SMS sort of gamifies the loan process, which makes it harder to even pay attention to the 7.5% interest rate. Another thing is that in the first place, a 7.5% interest rate, what does that even mean? How do I even think about that? And And so Marianne Bertrand and Adair Morris have done this work where they, in fact, try to make it easier to understand the cost of, say, a payday loan where their interest rates are even higher, and you're familiar with this, right? So there what they do is they can frame the cost of the loan in a few ways. So they can tell you the annualized interest rate, they can tell you the interest rate per 2 weeks, but rather than tell you the percentage cost of the loan, they can frame it in a much more concrete way, which is they can say, here is the actual dollar amount that you're paying with this loan. And so now when you put it in terms of an actual dollar amount, what does that do? Well, now it allows you to think about the things you have to trade off in order to take this loan. So I think that's one way if we can sort of put things into the terms that accentuate or make this trade-off thinking possible, then that allows us to start actually drawing on that expertise as well. Yeah.
So let me interrupt briefly. So we have questions for all three speakers. No, I think you should.
Oh.
If you could just sit with.
Oh, sorry.
Yes.
Frank's telling me to sit down.
Yes,
Okay.
exactly. We have a question for all three speakers. So we have 15 minutes. So I have prepared some questions as well. So if the audience does not ask any, you'll get my questions. But I hope we'll get audience questions, which will be much more interesting. Yes, please, Rachel.
Hi, I just had a question for Nandi. In providing these grants at different times, when you're providing the grants at different times in the Give Directly experiment, I was just thinking about if you've just paid off all your bills because you received this money and you were able to pay them off, aren't you then more likely to say I can wait longer because I don't have all of these pressing bills? So it may not be willpower, it might be.
Yeah, so yes. The question was, when you're giving these grants to the recipients in Kenya with the Give Directly program, the fact that they don't have, for a little while, the expenses on their, which they would have to pay off, is that something which is making them wait 2 weeks longer rather than anything to do with willpower? That's the question, right? Off the bat, one cannot rule out that possibility. The reason that we think that that's possibly less likely in this setting is because and we're just sort of doing the end line now, collecting information on what they actually spent the money on. That's ongoing at the moment. But and from the pilots that have happened on that, the things that people are actually spending the money on are not typically just daily expenses, right? So it's not that there is this sense of, okay, so a chunk of it is going, for instance, for a roof, people are starting a business, things like that, right? So the amount of $35 relative to the $965, if they were being spent on exactly the same kind of things, your explanation would seem more plausible. But in fact, a whole chunk of it is going to things which have a very different one-time nature. So we think that that's something which makes it less likely that it's a liquidity type of explanation that you're offering. Yeah.
Yes, please.
I have a follow-up question on that.
Yes.
I was also thinking about what is the smart decision here, and to me it seemed that wanting to get the money and spread it over the whole year would be the most financially smart decision, because then you can't spend it at once. I was wondering whether you also saw differences in that.
So, like I said, we haven't, let me ask the question, repeat the question rather. Her question is, what is the smarter way to spend the money here? Isn't it better to take it earlier and spread it through the rest of the year rather than wait longer to take it? Yeah. So I don't, given that we are agnostic in the, we are not telling people what to spend the money on. And I think we're very clear we don't want to do that because people have different requirements. Something that may not be directly, quote unquote, productive in terms of increasing your income, but if I have a thatched roof and I can sleep better at night, that means a lot, right? So I don't know what smart is in that sense, but if you are asking purely in terms of a financial return, that's one kind of consideration. But for example, when we ask people about the number of installments they want the money in, many people, and particularly the poorer people, say, oh no, that's a lot of money. I don't want it all at once, right? I'm afraid that I might burn it up or not use it very sensibly. So while what you're suggesting would be perfectly, rational for somebody who knows that he or she can take the money and, very nicely plan use it if the earlier they got it. The fact that people have all these other things which they think that can go against them, and make it counterproductive for them to take it as early as possible, are things that we don't tend to weigh as much. And given from what we see that being poorer is a bigger tax on your willpower, there are these other trade-offs that they're possibly thinking about, which you and I don't always tend to do.
I have a question. Can you think about poverty in relative terms here? So I'm from Denmark, for instance, and everyone can afford food, for instance. But relatively, I guess that the low-income households could feel poor when they look at their friends and families and so forth. Can we expect to see the same consequences by relative poverty? Do you get my question?
Yeah, so I think that's right. And you can just think about, for example, oh, sorry, let me repeat the question. So the question was, should we expect some of the same consequences when there's relative poverty as opposed to absolute poverty? And I think we can. I mean, you can just think about the studies that we do, or that I showed you, which you have a lot of these online participants who are not as poor as, say, a sugarcane farm in India. But then there's other work that people are doing as well on subjective social status. So Paul Piff and Michael Krauss are doing this work where they can get you to either compare yourself to somebody who's higher up the social ladder than you or lower down, and they find that you still see some of the same effects coming out of those relative comparisons as well. Now, there's a question about, well, just what exactly will you see replicated when you do a relative comparison versus just absolute poverty, and I don't know that we've mapped out that space as well, but there are some things that you do see translating to relative comparisons. Yeah, thanks.
It seems like a lot of the things that you're talking about relate to the second part of, like, if you're thinking about thinking fast and slow, a lot of what you're talking about is slow thinking. So like executive controls, a lot of that's very deliberative. But I'm wondering, is there any research showing that there's distributional differences, in particular for the poor, in automatic thinking? Like, do they have less access to the kind of cultural tools or automatic kind of rules of thumb to get ahead?
So the question was, okay, so a lot of this seems like what we're looking at is something like thinking fast or thinking slow, and to some extent, so what I showed you may look more like thinking slow, and the question is, well, is there any evidence that they might also have less access to heuristic rules of thumb and so on, right?
That are useful for getting ahead, like how to prepare for college. You said.
Yeah, good. And so one thing, let me just say one slight thing where I would differ from this, which is, we wouldn't say that the poor are just thinking slow or engaging in more systematic thinking across the board. It seems to be, at least so far, what we know is it's much more about this trade-off thinking in particular. But then to the heart of your question, which is, okay, about the actual heuristic rules of thumb, I mean, it's certainly the case that the poor do not have as much knowledge about the financial systems, and there's less financial literacy. And so one thing that Antoinette Shore has done is actually, I think she's looking at what happens when you can actually give people, say, I think she has like 5 heuristics for business practice or savings. And there she finds that, if nothing else, giving those heuristics as opposed to like a broader lesson might be an effective way. So I don't know of whether we have like clear differences in do they think slower or think faster, but there is evidence that if you give them ways to think fast, then it is beneficial. Does that make sense?
I think one other thing I would add to that is that it's not necessarily clear that that's the direction we would want to go with this. So you could also think about kind of the structure of the decisions that they're making and the safety nets that exist for that. So, if one of the issues that they have to make a lot of these decisions, which tax their bandwidth and require a lot of mental resources, maybe a better solution would be to find ways to avoid having to tax those resources. And so you could imagine things like direct deposit of funds into a bank account rather than putting it into your pocket. And that might be kind of a different approach that would solve the same type of issue.
Let me just use my role as a moderator and just ask a question as well. I don't need the mic. Which is sort of, what do we know about the awareness of people of such effects? So in some sense, you could sort of think, well, if there's some times when people have high bandwidth and sometimes people have low bandwidth, then you could sort of have interventions that essentially move important decisions to times when people have high bandwidth. And you could sort of either do that directly, or you could just inform people of like, well, bandwidth is really important, and you should try to make important decisions at time when you're not cognitively taxed. Where are we sort of on that front in terms of, do we understand these effects as people on ourselves, and can we use such understanding potentially for interventions?
I'll start on that on a few specific topics that I know more about. So, for example, with regard to nutrition and sleep, it's not very clear at all that people are actually good at judging the impacts of those underlying features on their cognition. So, for example, there's very interesting evidence in the sleep literature that when you ask people, what happens when you're sleep deprived, they say, oh, for the first day or two, it's bad for me, but then I'm fine. I've got it. I get used to it. No, you don't. Turns out you just keep doing worse and worse and worse. It's a very cumulative effect, but people have this very wrong perception of it. And the same thing seems to be true of nutrition in India. So if you ask people, does eating more make you more productive? Does it help you think better? They say, no, in fact, it actually makes me do worse because I feel tired. And that's true in the short run. There is this immediate effect. Think of like eating a Thanksgiving dinner. You just feel tired for that day, but you get used to that. Physiologically, you adapt, but it takes a long time to do that. And so, in fact, they don't have a very good perception of the fact that this is a beneficial activity to be doing. And so I think it might be hard to leverage those times, at least in some of these contexts. Anything to add?
So I don't think that we yet have, I'm not aware of any studies which sort of talk about evidence that people being self-aware or being trained to be self-aware yet about when they're in a better frame of mind to make decisions. In fact, I'm thinking of this work that this graduate student who is at LSE is doing on asking people whether they want conditional or unconditional cash transfers. And in fact, people may, and he says in that paper that they actually choose conditional transfers, but the reasons that they're doing it, and if we were to link it to the work here, you would think that conditionality in some ways sort of, if there are multiple things to do, whether it's send your kid to school or, make sure you do a bunch of things, it is imposing more tax on your bandwidth. But the reasons that he sort of parses out from his data and the responses about why people make those choices has something to do with intra-household bargaining and having more sort of control over these things. So I think that something as subtle as this, I'm inferring from that is that people are not paying as much attention to these things rather than something which they think is much more in their face in terms of how much of that money would be under their control or somebody else's within the household.
Can I just add a bit more to that? So one thing we're going to be asking people about lean and slack months during our end line. Yeah. Maybe we should also be asking them about periods where they think they have more attentional capacity versus not, and see whether it matches up with that. Yeah. But maybe here's just one more thing on that. So this is to Heather's point about the way that scarcity or poverty can interfere with enjoyment. So this is just one sort of online study that we did, but we have people play a game and then they get paid based on their performance of the game, but not really. So we manipulate where they get paid a lot or get paid a little. And then we tell them you're going to have to watch this video and you're going to pay, say, 50 tokens to watch this video. And we're going to ask you how much you enjoyed the video. Now, so we have half of our participants who we've made poor or made them rich in the lab by paying them a lot or paying them a little. And then for half of the participants, we also have them pay the 50 tokens up front and then watch the video, or they pay the 50 tokens as they go. So for every minute that they're watching the video, it takes away 10 tokens, and they're told up front, this is going to cost you 50 tokens overall. So some people are poor, some are rich, some pay up front, some pay as they go. And so for people who are paying as they go during the video, they're enjoying the video less, okay, if you're poor. If you're poor, you're enjoying it less. Why? Because you're constantly reminded of how much this thing is costing you. So then we later on ask people, if you were to do this again, would you want to pay up front or would you want to pay as you go? And you see the poor are more likely to say, I'd want to pay as I go, perhaps setting themselves up for a less enjoyable experience or a more distracting experience, because you can imagine that, well, paying that 50 tokens up front is a startling amount, and so they're less willing to do that. But that's some evidence that maybe they're not quite aware of the distracting the consequence of distraction also. Yeah.
Thank you. I have time for one more question, I think, so please.
Based on what you're saying about how the poor think differently, I'm wondering if some of the surveys that we've been using for measuring employee engagement, like the Gallup surveys, are those things really measuring some of the things we should be looking at for employee engagement? I don't know if the panel has any thoughts.
So the question was about whether the typical measurements of employee engagement might be missing some of these details. So I should say I'm not an expert. Even though I'm in an organizational behavior department, I know nothing about organizational behavior. So I probably shouldn't have admitted that on tape, but yeah, okay. So. Yeah, sorry.
I don't know the questions that you were referring
Right,
to.
so the Gallup survey talked about well-being and how people actually feel about work, going to work, and the meaning that they attach to work, and how they generally job satisfaction, those things. So based on what you were talking about, I was wondering if there's any thinking if some of those generic questions that apply to the UK would apply to developing countries, if people would think about it differently. The framing is versus, looking at my house versus looking at this, the beer, and if it's coming from a more expensive place or a less expensive place.
I don't know that I have a huge amount specifically on that, but one thing that strikes me from kind of Anuja's discussion on priming is then things like order effects might matter a lot to how people would perceive those questions. So if, for example, they're prompted first on subjective well-being questions about, say, their wealth or their kind of steps in the SES ladder or the like, then you could imagine that could spill over in a very different way to some of these later questions as well. So that would be very context specific, but I could see kind of some implication there for that.
And I guess then just another small point would be then what you might care about is not just what is your overall engagement, what is your overall enjoyment, but then what you want are finer grained questions to say, for example, are there moments during the day when you're more distracted or things like that? And you can imagine those varying as a function of the broader context. Yeah.
So I have one more short question between the bunch.
I'm wondering if there are studies about the effect of low income versus high income in Bruno Frey and Legrand, the crowding out effect of monetary incentive. The crowding out effect when if there are big study, empirical study among the difference between low income and high income.
So the question is about whether there are differences in crowding out from incentives for lower income and wealthier individuals. I don't personally know of this work. If anyone else in the room knows, then that's great. I don't know if you guys.
No, we're not aware.
Okay. So we end with we don't know.
Okay, terrific. Thanks so much, everybody, for coming. Thanks so much for the presentations.
Taxation or welfare spending is much lower as well, right? But what we've been pursuing in this research agenda, which Frank gave you an overview of, is that maybe the causality goes somehow in the opposite direction. That instead of bad decisions being what leads to poverty, there's something potentially about poverty which ends up that people make these bad choices. In particular, is there something about being poor that actually makes you dumber, right? The state of being poor. And is it, does it somehow have an effect on your willpower potentially? And that's what then leads to these bad outcomes. So some of the work that I've already done with a bunch of co-authors, Sendil Mulainathan, Eldar Shafir, and Jiaying Zhao, is one of the things that we looked at was the first piece of what I had on that earlier slide. What is the impact of poverty on people's IQ? Does it somehow impair their cognitive function? And we found evidence for that doing this study with sugarcane farmers in South India, where we compare the same person with himself or herself, mostly himself because farmers are all male, but before and after a sugarcane harvest, where it's a very long crop cycle, and so just a month before the harvest, or even right after the harvest, they're down to the wire, they have very little money, and a few weeks after the harvest, they get their entire year's income. So we're sort of able to establish that. And I'd like to spend most of the rest of the time here talking about what we're currently doing. And so today I'm going to say a little bit, one piece is about how does poverty have an effect on willpower? This is what we've been looking at. And this is, again, joint work with Anuj, who's here, and Sendil Mulainathan and Paul Niehaus. And what's the context in which we've been looking at this question? We've been looking at this in the context of what's called an unconditional cash transfer, which means there are no strings attached. You just get a bunch of money, give that to a poor person. And this is in collaboration with an NGO called Give Directly, which operates in Kenya. And they make one-time unconditional, very large transfers to the tune of $1,000, no questions asked, to people whom they identify using various satellite technology measures of who is poor, right? And the measure of willpower that we are going to use is about, we ask transfer recipients when they want the money, and what we're going to use as our measure is how long they're willing to defer or delay their actual receipt of the grant. That's going to be our willpower measure. So let me tell you a little bit about the design. So a typical GD here is just Give Directly, the NGO. And typically, all these transfers are done through what's called M-Pesa or mobile money. So it's through your phone. You get the money. There's no intermediary involved. And every transfer has 2 stages. One, first, to just set it up, they have a token transfer. They want to make sure everybody's, their mobile account is working smoothly, et cetera, et cetera. So that's the first stage. They give a token transfer. And then in the second stage is the rest of the money. That's what I'm calling the main transfer. And so what we did as part of our intervention is, at that first stage, that's really where all our action is at the moment, is that we gave some people that token transfer in December of 2014.
Amount of volatility in people's lives. And here for the portfolios of the poor, give some sort of striking examples of, you can see the revenues and inventory purchase and expenses for one particular person, of like how volatile some of the incomes and consumption patterns are for the poor. So it's not just people have like low income levels, so like $1 or $2 per day, but there's also a lot of variation. So sometimes they have like $20 on any given day, but then there's like a drought or like of revenues where they have like nothing for quite a while, and sort of there's huge struggles of people to sort of smooth these the variation over time. Now, we also learn a lot about sort of individuals that are involved in these studies. And the portfolios of the poor, but if you read like Poor Economics by Abhijit Banerjee and Esther Duflo, you read a lot of individuals who are sort of exposed to poverty and what kind of decisions they make, and then sort of give good examples and insights into the lives of the poor. So here, for example, you see Faisal. He's an example from the portfolios of the poor. And Faisal is from Uttar Pradesh in India, a physical laborer who has a household income from about like $30 to $40 per month. And in the story that's told, this individual breaks his legs, which is terrible for a physical laborer because you can't do work. In particular, Faisal did not have health insurance. So that's sort of the worst thing that can happen. He can't do any work, but he's also not compensated for that. So now in the story, Faisal then, instead of seeing a doctor, because he doesn't have a lot of money and savings and no insurance, he doesn't see a doctor immediately, but instead he sort of tries to go to some healer, try to sort of wait it out and to see whether things get better on its own. But as it turns out, that was like a pretty bad idea, or that turned out not well for him. Instead, it took about 6 months until he finally sort of like essentially sought treatment and got better. But sort of like he has now 6 months of lost wages and had to pay eventually health expenses from about $250, which is sort of 8 months of his earnings as well. And one interesting part in the story is that Faisal, instead of like getting high interest rate loans, he was just, his family was getting a lot of interest-free loans from friends and neighbors. They're drawing down savings, they're consuming less and like, so there are many sort of ways in which that Faisal and his family managed to overcome this hardship. So it's sort of fair to say that overall we learned quite a bit of like what it means for Faisal and people like him to deal with health shocks and other sort of economic hardship. And we sort of understand a lot of the material consequences of such shocks. But what we don't understand that well is what is going on in Faisal's head. So what you understand is what the decision that he makes. You understand how much he earns, how much he saves, how much he borrows, and like we know about that. What we don't know much about is what kind of decisions, why does he make the decisions that he makes, what constrains his decision-making capacity, and how we could potentially help Faisal and others to make better decisions. We also don't know very well about how does he feel in such a situation. What makes him happy? Because after all, in any policies that we might want to make, we want to make. Hello everyone. Thanks so much everyone for coming. But how could you not come after Anusha's brilliant introduction of this session? I'm very happy to moderate and introduce the session on poverty, cognitive function, and decision making. Let me first sort of thank the organizers and everybody who's been helping to put together this fantastic conference. It's great to be here. This session will include 3 experts in poverty research. We'll start off with Ananda Mani from University of Warwick. Then Heather Schofield from UPenn will talk, and afterward Anu Shah from University of Chicago. I'll tell you a little bit about their work overall, what they're going to be talking about. let me give you first some overview of what the session will be like. I'll tell you 15 minutes of like a brief introduction of the session. Then each of the speakers will talk for about 20 minutes, uninterrupted, unless there's sort of really burning questions that you might have. And then there will be 15 minutes of questions from the audience. So if you can, please hold your questions until then. Okay. So what I would like to start with is sort of the observations that over the past 2 decades, we have made a lot of progress in understanding the economic lives of the poor. And this was sort of pioneered by people like Ann Case and Angus Deaton. We've learned a lot about sort of careful surveying techniques, about sort of just understanding basic aspects of the lives of the poor. And then with the foundation of JPAL and IPA and other similar-minded organizations, there have been a large number of carefully conducted RCTs that taught us a lot about the economic lives of the poor, what it means to be poor in financial terms, what kind of decisions people make, economic decisions people make, and how we may be able to improve them through carefully designed policies. Such knowledge doesn't just come from RCTs, but also from careful surveys, such as the one you can see here, the Portfolios of the Poor by Karlan et al., which essentially just follow people, poor individuals' financial lives by tracking them every week. So every week they would sort of check in on people's finances, on their debt, on their expenses, on their savings and the like, which gives us a very good picture of the economic lives of the poor. And broadly speaking, we're taking together, we have a pretty good understanding, or a much better understanding than we used to about the economic, or what it means to be poor in economic terms. And this is sort of a very broad set of knowledge that we have acquired through that. This range from like health, as you can see here, for example, we learned a lot about individuals' health status, what it means to be poor in terms of just survival probabilities. We learned a lot about the demand and supply for health and health behaviors and sort of its consequences. We also learned some somewhat surprising facts. For example, here's the fraction of individuals living in a household with a TV. And you might sort of think, well, that's actually much higher than we expected. Why do these individuals have a TV when they don't spend enough money on eating sufficiently or having enough to pay the doctor? We also learned quite a bit of not just, so when you think about sort of what poverty means for people, it's not just having low income levels, but also a huge poverty. So it's not just the poor are poor, they don't have money, and they think about not having money a lot. Well, being poor also means that people are more likely to be in pain, they're more likely to be tired, they're more likely to be hungry, they're more likely to drink excessively, than many other such factors. And you might sort of think, well, you're looking at research in psychology, you might think, well, these factors may affect cognition, decision-making, and productivity as well. And then Anuj finally will talk about the expertise of the poor. You can think of this as like sort of the upside or positive effects that we may also want to focus on, which is, well, poverty captures cognitive function. You might think, well, if poverty actually captures cognitive function, as in people focus a lot on poverty, well, that should entail some benefits as well. And Anuj will show some compelling evidence that, in fact, the poor actually do better, at least in some decisions or domains. That's all I have to say. So thanks so much for coming again. And we'll start off with Ananda with her work on scarcity. Thank you.
Clicker. This is Oh, I see. So I wouldn't be able to hear it. Okay. All right. Very good. Yeah, I think you said that. Okay. Just making sure I understand how this clicker works. Yep. Thank you all for coming. It's a pleasure to be here. I guess Frank has already mentioned very eloquently, a bunch of ways in which we are puzzled by the way poor people behave. And as he mentioned, some of this is about health, some of this is about parenting, some of this is also about taking investment opportunities, which they've been shown to be very high return. The poor know that, and it's cheap to implement, and yet they don't do it. There's work on fertilizer use is the thing I'm thinking about here. But the point here, as he alluded to, is that not all of this can be explained by lack of money. It doesn't take money to pay attention to how much TV your kids are watching, for instance. And so not all of this is about lack of information either. And so the kind of explanation we get left with is somehow the poor are quote unquote different, right? And people have very clear ideas about what they mean by different. So here's something from the World Values Survey. This is for the US, and people think that people who are poor are lazy and they lack willpower, right? More than half of Americans think that. And so the implicit idea here is that people make these bad choices, and that's what keeps them poor, right? And why do they make these bad choices? Either they're dumb, or somehow they lack the willpower. And that's what keeps them where they are, right? And in fact, that slide which I showed you on willpower is from this paper, which shows that when there's less sympathy, then the amount of support for redistribution
make people happier. But in some sense, we don't have a very good understanding what determines his or Faisal's and other people's happiness. And only recently, very recently, we have started to explore such questions. And you can think of this panel as like sort of a preliminary progress report of recent research that has sort of thought to tackle such question and try to get into the heads or into the minds of the lives of the poor and try to understand better what decisions they make and how we might be able to improve their decision-making processes. And you might sort of wonder, well, why should we do that? Why is it sort of important to understand individuals' cognitive function? Well, one answer is there are many, and this is based on many RCTs and careful studies, there are many seemingly suboptimal behaviors among the poor, and Anuj has already alluded to some of those earlier. There's underinvestment, undersavings, bad parenting, low productivity, lack of punctuality, low drug adherence, and the like. So, many sort of like behaviors where you think, well, people could do better, but we don't really understand why they don't do better. And until recently, people have sort of come up with like perhaps sometimes compelling, but sort of maybe not the right explanation, which is sort of they're pretty bad environmental conditions. For example, lack of transportation might sort of like, or reliable transportation might explain lack of punctuality. Predatory lending might explain why people underinvest or like take too high loans. There might also be selection or omitted variables. For example, people just have low education. Well, if you have low education, then you're not productive, and you might also be a bad parent because you just don't understand some of the advice that you might be given. But what we're trying to focus on here is the treatment effect of poverty. That is, does being poor itself affect people's decisions and behaviors in ways that might be reinforcing poverty? And at the bottom line and in the back of our heads, minds, there should be sort of a question, or there is a question, is there perhaps what I want to call a behavioral poverty trap, in which the broad line of argument is, well, poverty impedes cognitive function, decision-making, and productivity through various ways, and this in turn may feed back to future poverty. And then, even if there's not a poverty trap itself, at the very least, this may lead to reduced mobility. So if you're poor and try to become richer, and Raj Chetty has quite a bit of work on that and co-authors recently in the US, how is it possible, or is it possible to become rich? And these factors that we're looking at here might sort of impede mobility. Now, let me sort of give you an overview of the session, and then let you enjoy the speakers' presentations. So first, we start off with Ananda, who you might know from, as Anuj also mentioned earlier, from the original scarcity work. So poverty, the idea here is that poverty captures people's minds and cognitive function, but cognitive function is limited, such that then, when poverty takes away a lot of people's cognitive function, well, then they may not be able to make as good of decisions that people might want to do. And Ananda will in particular talk about whether cash transfers and insurance mitigate such effects. And this sort of like, you can think of this as a progress report on the scarcity work that Ananda has done earlier. Then Heather will talk about other correlates of